They don't leave because you weren't enough. They leave because your presence started demanding something they were never ready to give: emotional depth, consistency, and accountability. And here's the truth no one tells you. Avoidant personalities don't fear love. They fear losing control inside love. But the moment you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, and start choosing your self-respect over their confusion, something shifts. That's when they realize your silence is louder than their excuses, and your value is no longer negotiable. Avoidant individuals are often misunderstood as emotionally distant, cold, or uninterested in love. But the deeper psychological reality is far more complex than surface behavior suggests. At the core, avoidant attachment is not a lack of emotional capacity, it is a learned defense. System shaped by early emotional experiences where closeness may have felt unsafe, inconsistent, or overwhelming. Because of this conditioning, when emotional intimacy begins to deepen in adult relationships, their nervous system does not interpret it as comfort or connection. Instead, it interprets closeness as pressure, expectation, or even a loss of personal control. This is why someone with avoidant tendencies can appear perfectly fine in the beginning of a relationship, even charming, attentive, and emotionally available to a degree, but gradually shift into distance once emotional depth starts increasing. It is important to understand that avoidants are not necessarily avoiding love itself. What they are avoiding is the emotional vulnerability that comes with dependence, exposure, and being seen too deeply. For many of them, closeness unconsciously activates internal fear responses such as "I will be controlled," "I will lose my independence," or "I will be emotionally trapped." These thoughts are not always conscious decisions, rather. They are automatic protective reactions formed over years of emotional adaptation. So when they start to feel emotionally overwhelmed, their system seeks relief by creating distance. That distance can take many forms: delayed replies, emotional withdrawal, increased focus on work or hobbies, or suddenly acting indifferent after moments of connection. From the outside, this behavior is often interpreted as rejection or a loss of interest. However, in many cases, the emotional truth is more conflicted. An avoidant person can genuinely care about someone and still feel the need to step back. This creates a confusing pattern where affection and distance coexist. One moment they may show warmth, and the next they may emotionally disconnect. This inconsistency is not necessarily manipulation. It is internal conflict between the desire for connection and the fear of being consumed by it. The turning point in most relationships with avoidant individuals happens when emotional expectations increase. For example, when a partner starts seeking clarity, commitment, or consistent emotional reassurance, the avoidance system may feel pressured. Even normal relationship needs like regular communication or emotional availability can feel intense to them if they are not emotionally regulated. As pressure increases, their instinct is not to engage more deeply, but to step back to regain emotional equilibrium. This is why chasing them or demanding immediate clarity often produces the opposite result. It intensifies their need for space rather than bringing them closer. What makes this dynamic especially painful for the other person is that avoidants rarely explain their withdrawal in a clear or emotionally transparent way. Instead, they may minimize the issue, act busy, or emotionally detach without explanation. This creates confusion, self-doubt, and overthinking in the partner, who may begin to believe they did something wrong. In reality, the avoidant withdrawal is usually less about the partner's value, and more about the avoidant person's internal capacity to handle emotional intensity at that moment. Ultimately, avoidant psychology is rooted in protection, not indifference. The deeper issue is that emotional closeness activates discomfort rather than safety, and until that internal pattern is understood and worked through, their response to intimacy will continue to involve distance whenever emotional depth begins to feel too real or too consuming. When someone with an avoidant attachment style pulls away, they may feel a sense of relief or a sense of freedom. It is very easy for the other person to experience it as emotional rejection, indifference, or even a deliberate act of hurt. But psychologically, withdrawal in avoidant individuals is rarely about rejecting the partner's value. It is more accurately understood as a self-protective emotional response, triggered when intimacy begins to exceed their internal comfort threshold. In their inner world, closeness does not simply feel like connection, it can feel like pressure, expectation, or emotional exposure that they were never fully taught how to regulate. To understand this, you have to look at how avoidant coping mechanisms are formed. Many avoidant individuals learned early in life that depending on others emotionally did not always lead to comfort or consistency. They may have experienced caregivers who were emotionally unavailable, critical, intrusive, or unpredictable. As a result, they adapted by developing a strong internal belief, I can only rely on myself. Over time, this becomes not just a belief but a nervous system pattern. So when adult relationships begin to recreate emotional closeness, the body reacts before the mind can logically process it. That reaction is often discomfort, tension, or the urge to create space. This is why their withdrawal often feels sudden or confusing. From the outside, everything might seem to be going well. There may have been intimacy, affection, or emotional connection, and then, almost unexpectedly, they begin to distance themselves. They may become less responsive, less emotionally expressive, or more focused on external distractions like work, hobbies, or isolation. This shift is not always a conscious decision to end the relationship. In many cases, it is a subconscious attempt to regulate internal emotional overload. It is important to recognize that for avoidance, emotional closeness can activate an internal alarm system. This alarm does not necessarily say, "This person is bad," or "I don't care anymore." Instead, it signals something more primitive and fear-based, such as "I am losing independence," "I am becoming too emotionally dependent," or "I need to regain control of my emotional space." When this internal alarm is triggered, their natural response is not to move closer for reassurance, but to step back to restore a sense of stability. This is where misunderstandings in relationships become very painful. The partner often interprets distance as loss of interest and responds by trying to get closer, communicate more, or seek clarity. However, for the avoidant individual, these attempts can feel like increased pressure. Even if the intention is love, the experience on their side can feel overwhelming. As a result, the more the partner pursues emotional closeness, the more the avoidant feels the need to withdraw further. This creates a push-pull dynamic that can become emotionally exhausting for both people involved. Another key aspect of avoidant withdrawal is that it is often followed by internal rationalization. Instead of openly expressing discomfort, they may justify their distance in logical terms, being busy, needing space, focusing on personal goals, or simply not being in the right mindset. These explanations are not always dishonest, but they are often incomplete. They explain the behavior without revealing the deeper emotional trigger behind it, which is vulnerability, discomfort. At the core of this pattern, withdrawal is not about punishing the partner. It is about self-regulation. The avoidant person is trying to reduce internal emotional intensity that they do not know how to process safely in real time. Unfortunately, because this coping mechanism relies on distance rather than communication, it often creates emotional confusion and insecurity in the partner, even when no intentional harm is meant. So when we say their withdrawal is self-protection, not always rejection, it means recognizing that what looks like emotional disinterest is often emotional overwhelm in disguise. The behavior is protective, not destructive in intention, but it can still be painful in impact. When someone repeatedly finds themselves chasing an avoidant partner seeking clarity, consistency, reassurance, or emotional presence, they often don't realize that their behavior is slowly reshaping the emotional balance of the relationship. What begins as genuine concern or a desire to fix confusion gradually turns into a pattern where one person is overfunctioning emotionally while the other becomes increasingly passive or distant. In this dynamic, chasing does not create closeness, it creates imbalance. And over time, that imbalance lowers your emotional position in the relationship without you even noticing it happening. Chasing usually starts from a place of emotional discomfort. When an avoidant person pulls away, the natural human response is anxiety. What happened? Did I do something wrong? Are they losing interest? In order to reduce this uncertainty, the mind pushes for action, sending more messages, asking more questions, trying to reconnect quickly, or over-explaining feelings. The intention is connection, but the impact is pressure. From your perspective, it feels like you are trying to save the relationship. From their perspective, especially someone with avoidant tendencies, it can feel like emotional intensity they are not prepared to engage with. This is where an important psychological shift happens. In healthy emotional dynamics, both people contribute effort, clarity, and emotional presence. But in an chasing dynamic, one person begins to carry the emotional weight of the relationship. They initiate most conversations. They seek resolution after conflict. They try to fix distance, and they often adjust their behavior to avoid losing the connection. Meanwhile, the avoidant partner becomes increasingly accustomed to receiving emotional energy without having to match it consistently. This creates a subtle but powerful imbalance. One person is investing more, while the other is learning they can invest less and still maintain access to the relationship. Over time, this imbalance changes how attraction and respect function in the dynamic. Emotional attraction is not only built on affection, it is also built on self-respect, boundaries, and emotional stability. When you constantly chase someone who withdraws, you unintentionally communicate that your emotional state depends on their availability. This does not mean you are weak, it means the dynamic is becoming centered around their behavior rather than your own emotional grounding. And when a relationship becomes centered around one person's inconsistency, the emotional frame shifts. Avoidant individuals are particularly sensitive to pressure, even when it is expressed through care. When they sense that someone is urgently trying to pull them closer, their nervous system often registers it as demand rather than connection. As a result, they instinctively move in the opposite direction to regain autonomy. This creates a paradox. The more you chase to restore closeness, the more space they create to restore independence. Neither person is necessarily acting with bad intentions, but the emotional mismatch keeps widening the gap. Another overlooked consequence of chasing is internal self-abandonment. When you repeatedly override your own emotional boundaries, waiting for replies that never come, tolerating inconsistency, or accepting unclear behavior, you slowly begin to disconnect from your own emotional standards. You start normalizing confusion. You start rationalizing inconsistency, and you begin to prioritize keeping the other person close over maintaining your own emotional stability. This is often the most damaging part of the pattern, because it shifts your focus from, "Is this healthy for me?" to "How do I not lose them?" The difficult truth is that chasing does not create security, it creates dependency. And dependency, especially in relationships involving avoidant dynamics, rarely leads to closeness. Instead, it reinforces the exact cycle both people are struggling with. One pursues, one retreats. The emotional distance grows not because of lack of care, but because of how the interaction pattern reinforces fear and imbalance on both sides. Ultimately, lowering your emotional position in this context does not mean losing value as a person. It means losing balance in the dynamic. And the only way that balance begins to restore is when pursuit stops becoming the primary strategy for connection, and emotional self-respect starts becoming the foundation of how you engage. Self-respect is the turning point in any avoidant dynamic because it changes the emotional structure of the relationship without needing arguments, explanations, or emotional pressure. When someone is dealing with an avoidant partner, they may feel like they're walking on eggshells, trying to avoid conflict and rejection. The common instinct is to try harder, communicate more, prove more care, reduce misunderstandings, and maintain connection at all costs. But the real shift begins when effort is no longer driven by fear of loss, but guided by emotional standards. Self-respect is not about playing games or pretending not to care. It is about refusing to abandon yourself in order to keep access to someone else. In avoidant dynamics, the pattern is often built on emotional imbalance. One person tends to pursue closeness, while the other tends to regulate distance. Over time, this creates a cycle where emotional pressure becomes the default response to disconnection. The avoidant person withdraws to feel safe, and the other person chases to feel secure. But chasing rarely creates security, it creates exhaustion. This is where self-respect becomes disruptive to the cycle in a healthy way. The moment you stop overgiving, over-explaining, or over-reassuring, the predictable rhythm of the dynamic is interrupted. Self-respect begins with emotional awareness. It is the ability to notice when you are acting from anxiety rather than clarity. For example, asking yourself, am I sending this message because I genuinely want to communicate, or because I am afraid of losing them? That distinction matters because avoidant dynamics often blur emotional intention. When you operate from fear, your behavior becomes reactive. When you operate from self-respect, your behavior becomes intentional. And intentional behavior is naturally more grounded, less chaotic, and more stable. When you stop chasing emotional clarity from someone who consistently avoids it, something important changes in how you are perceived, not because you are trying to manipulate perception, but because the emotional energy you bring into the dynamic shifts. Instead of constant pursuit, emotional urgency, and repeated attempts to fix distance, you begin to represent stability. You are no longer overextending to compensate for their inconsistency. You are simply observing what is being offered and responding accordingly. This change alone alters the emotional equation. Avoidant individuals are highly sensitive to emotional intensity, but they are also sensitive to emotional stability. While they may initially respond to pressure by withdrawing further, they often become more aware of a person's value when that pressure disappears. This is not because they suddenly miss you in a romanticized sense, but because the emotional environment becomes less threatening and more neutral. In a neutral space, they are more likely to reflect rather than react, and reflection is where emotional awareness sometimes begins to grow. However, the most important part of self-respect is not its effect on the avoidant personite, is its effect on you. When you stop over-investing in someone who is inconsistent, you regain emotional balance. You stop interpreting distance as a personal failure. You stop measuring your worth based on someone else's availability. And slowly, you begin to rebuild internal standards that may have been weakened by emotional uncertainty. This is the point where clarity returns, because you are no longer emotionally negotiating your value. Self-respect also introduces boundaries without confrontation. You do not need long explanations or emotional speeches to establish them. Your behavior naturally reflects them. You reply when you want to, not out of panic. You engage when there is mutual effort, not when you are trying to revive one-sided connection. You stop trying to earn consistency from someone who is not offering it freely. And this is where the emotional power shift happens, not through control, but through withdrawal of self-abandonment. Ironically, this is often the moment avoidant individuals begin to notice a change. Not because you are doing something to trigger them, but because the emotional dynamic they were used to no longer exists in the same form. The pursuit slows down, the emotional pressure reduces, the imbalance that once allowed them to remain distant without consequence begins to dissolve. What remains is a clearer reflection of reality, not emotional chaos. Ultimately, self-respect is not about winning someone back or forcing change in them. It is about restoring emotional order within yourself first. And in avoidant dynamics, that internal shift is often the only change powerful enough to transform the entire interaction pattern, whether the relationship continues or not. What often confuses people in relationships with avoidant individuals is that emotional intensity, desperation, or repeated reassurance seeking does not increase attraction. In many cases, it reduces it. Avoidant psychology is deeply sensitive to emotional pressure, but it is also highly attuned to emotional tone. This means they are not just responding to what you say, but how your emotional energy feels in the interaction. When your behavior becomes driven by anxiety, fear of loss, or constant need for clarity, it creates a sense of emotional demand. Even if your intentions are loving, the experience on their side can feel overwhelming or invasive. This is why avoidant individuals often do not respond well to chasing or emotional pleading. It is not that they are incapable of empathy or connection. It is that emotional intensity activates their internal defense system. When they feel emotionally cornered, their instinct is to create space, not closeness. But when they encounter calmness, grounded behavior, and emotional independence, something different happens. They are no longer reacting to pressure, they are observing stability. And stability is something their nervous system can register as safer, even if they do not consciously articulate it that way. Confidence in this context does not mean arrogance, dominance, or emotional coldness. It means emotional regulation. It is the ability to remain steady, even when the relationship feels uncertain. Instead of spiraling into overthinking or chasing explanations, a confident emotional stance is able to tolerate ambiguity without collapsing into panic-driven behavior. This kind of energy communicates, I am okay within myself, even if things are unclear with you. That message is far more powerful than repeated attempts to prove worth or secure reassurance. Avoidant individuals often become more aware of a person's emotional value when that person is not constantly available on demand. When someone is always chasing, always explaining, always trying to fix distance, they become predictable. And predictability in emotional dynamics often reduces curiosity. But when that same person becomes grounded, less reactive, and more selective with their emotional investment, they become less emotionally readable. This is where reflection begins. Not because you are playing a strategy, but because emotional space has been created. It is important to understand that avoidants are not necessarily attracted to emotional distance itself. They are responding to the absence of pressure. When pressure is removed, they no longer feel the need to defend their autonomy as strongly. This allows them to process the relationship without feeling emotionally overwhelmed. In that space, they may begin to notice qualities they previously overlooked. Not because those qualities suddenly appeared, but because the emotional noise has reduced. However, the key point is not about changing the avoidant person's behavior. It is about recognizing how emotional energy influences relational dynamics. When you move from emotional urgency to emotional groundedness, you stop reinforcing the push-pull cycle. Instead of escalating their withdrawal through pressure, you introduce calmness into the system. Calmness does not force closeness, but it removes unnecessary emotional friction that often fuels distance. At the same time, being noticed by an avoidant person because of your calm energy should never become the goal. The real transformation happens internally. When you are no longer dependent on someone's immediate response to feel secure, your emotional center shifts back to you. You stop interpreting silence as danger. You stop equating distance with loss of value. And you begin to operate from a more stable emotional baseline. This is why confidence stands out. Not because it is loud, attention-seeking, or forceful, but because it is emotionally self-contained. It does not collapse under uncertainty. It does not chase validation to feel whole. It simply exists without emotional dependency on constant reassurance. And in avoidant dynamics, this kind of emotional presence naturally contrasts with patterns of pressure and pursuit. Ultimately, avoidants do not respond to force, they respond to emotional regulation. But more importantly, emotional regulation protects your own mental and emotional well-being. It ensures that your identity is not shaped by someone else's inconsistency. And that is where true strength lies. Not in trying to be chosen, but in remaining grounded whether you are chosen or not. The most important realization in any avoidant dynamic is that you cannot build a stable relationship by focusing on changing, fixing, or decoding the other person. The real transformation never starts with them, it starts with the moment you stop making their emotional availability the center of your decisions. When someone has an avoidant attachment pattern, their behavior is often inconsistent by nature. They move closer when they feel safe and withdraw when they feel emotionally overwhelmed. This push-pull cycle can keep the other person emotionally stuck in a loop of hope, confusion, and effort. But the breaking point of that cycle is not convincing them to stay consistent, it is choosing to stop revolving your emotional world around their inconsistency. Many people stay trapped in avoidant relationships because they believe understanding the psychology deeply will eventually lead to control over the outcome. They think, if I just respond correctly, give enough space, or say the right thing, they will finally stay. But this mindset keeps you locked in reaction mode. You are always adjusting yourself based on their behavior, instead of evaluating whether the dynamic itself is actually meeting your emotional needs. The truth is, no amount of perfect communication can create stability in someone who is not internally regulated enough to sustain consistent emotional closeness. Choosing yourself means shifting the question entirely. Instead of asking, how do I get them to come back closer? The question becomes, is this emotional pattern healthy for me long term? This is where emotional clarity begins to replace emotional confusion. Because when you are inside a push-pull dynamic, your mind tends to normalize inconsistency. You start interpreting brief moments of closeness as proof of potential, while ignoring the larger pattern of emotional instability. But when you step back, the full picture becomes clearer. Connection is not just about intensity, it is about consistency. The hardest part of choosing yourself is accepting that love alone is not enough to sustain emotional security. You can care deeply about someone and still recognize that the relationship is costing you your peace. Avoidant dynamics often create a situation where emotional effort is one-sided for long periods of time. One person is constantly trying to maintain connection, while the other regulates closeness on their own terms. Over time, this imbalance leads to emotional fatigue, even if the attachment is strong. Choosing yourself does not always mean walking away immediately, but it does mean stopping the behaviors that disconnect you from your own emotional center. It means you no longer chase clarity from someone who repeatedly avoids giving it. It means you stop overanalyzing silence and start observing patterns. It means you allow actions to speak louder than potential. Most importantly, it means you begin to measure relationships by how they make you feel consistently, not by occasional moments of emotional highs. When you reach this point, something subtle but powerful happens in the dynamic. You are no longer emotionally available in the same automatic way. You are no longer over-functioning to keep the connection alive. And this naturally changes how the other person experiences your presence. But even if their behavior does not change, your internal world does. And that is the real shift, because emotional stability is no longer dependent on their responses. The truth is, the goal was never to win an emotion. Avoidant person's full emotional consistency. The goal is to stop abandoning yourself in pursuit of it. When you choose yourself, you remove the emotional dependency that keeps you stuck in cycles of uncertainty. You begin to reclaim your time, your energy, and your sense of direction.